The whole person. In carrying out the Great Commission, we are to minister to the whole person, body, soul, and spirit. Here's Gene to explain.
Jesus illustrated this principle many, many times. But we're going to see him illustrate it in a very specific way in this particular event where he multiplies the loaves and the fishes and he feeds 5,000 men beside women and children, which meant it could have been 15,000 or 20,000 people that were in this particular event. Now, the continuity for this relates to the fact that when Jesus heard about John the Baptist's horrible death, he was very, very deeply grieved. No question about that. And so he wanted to be alone. He wanted to be away from the crowds. And this is what we read in Matthew chapter 14. When Jesus heard about it, that is, the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. And when the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. And as he stepped ashore, he saw a huge crowd, felt compassion for them, and healed their sick. Now, as I've researched this again, I've come to somewhat of a change of mind in terms of where this happened. There are various possibilities. There's no consensus. I had pretty much concluded that it was across the sea, if you were in Capernaum, and you look at the northern side of the sea and across over to that area, that was across the sea and where that took place. But I think it probably happened further south of Capernaum, maybe 4 or 5 miles south, and really at the foot of the Mount of Beatitudes, because there's an open wilderness there where Jesus may have got off the boat. Now, one of the interesting things is, as you look at this passage, it simply says, when the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. In other words, they must have seen him. They could see him out in that boat. And they could see where that boat was going, and they could see where that boat landed, and they came by foot, and they were there when he got off out of that boat. Now, I've also concluded that boat was probably out there in the sea for quite a while. They may have just gone out, set anchor, and Jesus had a time to be alone, to go through the grieving process. We don't know how long, and we don't know exactly whether or not what I've said is accurate, but it's a possibility. One thing we know is there were a group of people that followed him, and when he saw them, he had compassion for these people. Now, we read on, and I call this the disciples' frustration. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, "This place is a wilderness." In other words, there's no McDonald's over here. There's no fast food place. This place is a wilderness, and it is already late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves. Now, the fact of the matter is 5 miles would have been a long way. Taking their children and walking, trying to get home. It's already getting dark. It's late. And Jesus, as you know, they found a little boy, and he had 5 loaves. And by the way, those 5 loaves probably were like 5 little pancakes that his mama had packed for him. And it says 2 fish, and probably it was 2 little sardines. And that was his lunch. And you know what happened. Jesus multiplied that, and they ended up with 12 baskets left over. We read about that in Matthew 14:20. Everyone ate and was filled, and then they picked up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces from the multiplication of that food. And by the way, in the Gospel of John, I love to call this story the master of quantity. He just multiplied it. When he made the water wine, what kind of wine was it? It was the best wine. He was the master of quality. But here he's the master of quantity. Why? Because he was the Son of God. Now, why 12 baskets? I think one for each one of the apostles. To say, guys, Do you believe? This is just a reminder of what happened here. So Jesus is ministering, and he worked this miracle. And by the way, this miracle is in all four Gospels. But here, in a special way, he was concerned about the physical, psychological, and spiritual needs of those who followed him to this desolate place. He wasn't just concerned about their bodies. He was concerned about their emotions. He was concerned about their soul. And even though many of them would doubt who he was, he still fed them. He still took care of them. He still reached out to them and ministered to the whole person. That's why I use this principle for this story. In carrying out the Great Commission, we are to minister to the whole person, body, soul, and spirit. Which leads to a question for application. What can we learn from this today? Though we are to focus on meeting needs within the family of God, in what creative ways can we follow Christ's example and meet people's physical and psychological needs, even though they may not be interested in spiritual truth? That's what Jesus did, and the Apostle Paul affirmed that when he wrote to the Galatians. Look at this verse. Therefore, as we have opportunity, we must work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. In other words, what Paul is saying relates to what Jesus did in feeding the 5,000, feeding all those people. He says, be concerned for everybody. Paul emphasizes that, whether they're believers or unbelievers. But he said, you certainly are to have a priority for the family of God. And that's why he said, when you have opportunity, and wow, opportunities are everywhere. Therefore, as we have opportunity, we must work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. As I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the history of foreign missions. And it's something that the world really doesn't understand because they don't even understand Christian history. But think about the hospitals that have been started in Africa and Asia, other parts of the world. They were started by missionaries. They went into those cultures where they had no access to what we have access to and began to minister to the physical needs, regardless of what these people believed. As a result of that, many came to Christ, and they were able to minister not just to their physical and psychological needs, but also to their soul. Evangelical Christianity, through the missionary movement, has practiced this principle in unbelievable ways. And we need to be thankful for that. And it's a reality. It's a part of history. But we see that, I think, even today. We have so many opportunities in the own church, in my own church, a church that I founded, passed the baton of leadership a number of years ago, but I'm still a part of that church. My wife and family worship. And recently, we had a very unusual opportunity to practice this verse. It was called 2-22, where we were all challenged to do 2 hours serving in our community, regardless of who these people are and what they believe, to bring 2 bags of groceries, and then $22 to give away to 5 partners who are ministering to people in need. Well, what happened? In our own church, we brought in 64,000 pounds of food to give to 6 local food partners. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that I am thrilled with that. That's practicing what Jesus said we ought to practice. Also, we raised in 10 days over $190,000 and split it 5 ways to give 5 partners over $38,000 for their capital projects. I remember Pastor Jeff, who succeeded me, when he first came and proposed that we try to raise $100,000, the people who were making the decision said, wow, $100,000? You think, we raised $190,000. Now, I'm thrilled with that, especially that this relates to a church that I had the privilege of starting and then passing the baton, to see that kind of spiritual commitment on the part of people. So we need to rejoice, but we also need to take seriously throughout our lives in various ways this wonderful principle. So let me just repeat that principle to live by once again. In carrying out the Great Commission, we are to minister to the whole person, body, soul, and spirit. And who was our greatest example? Jesus Christ.